live there. We're live here. Hello, and welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about Dungeons & Dragons 5e versus Pathfinder 2e. But before we do that, buddy, why don't you the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
On this podcast, we talk about games, and today we are taking our, I don't even know, reheated internet fight that popped up in the Facebook chat over the weekend and turning it into a podcast episode because I have COVID and I can't go see Deadpool and Wolverine yet.
Yeah, and I got stuck in Indianapolis, and I also could not go see Deadpool versus Wolverine yet. But
yeah. But it's finally, okay, over the weekend at Gen Con, people finally got to get their hands on the new 5e rulebook. They're calling it the 2024 Player's Handbook. It is 5.5e. It is truly the exact same thing that 3.5 was for 5th edition, right? 5.5e is the most accurate way you could explain what this sort of rules update essentially amounts to. And I don't know, man. I wish they did that shit.
Yeah, and funnily enough, also last week, I think at Gen Con it's the official release, but last week, Player Core 2, which is effectively closing the loop on what is PF 2.5 is a little too strong, with like 2.25 maybe, where they did the remaster and rewrote a bunch of stuff to like streamline the rules a little bit. That happened in Pathfinder as well. So part of this discussion was that of all the people on our chat, I feel like I was really the only person that extensively played both PF2E and 5e. I've been playing PF2E for years now. I right before Gen Con literally just finished an 8-year 5e campaign. So
did you reach level 20?
No, 17.
Okay.
It was one of those things where like the GM was like, I'm not going to make you level up like on paper. So we rented a cabin and we went to the middle of the woods, and at some point I was like, so do we level up? He's like, I'm not going to make you level up on paper for like the last session. And I was kind of like, but I want to. But all the other players were maybe not so enthusiastic. But yeah, my kind of top line is that I prefer PF2E, but I do think there are some things that both systems do better than the other, right? Like, and we were going to talk a little bit about this today.
Yeah, so I have a lot of experience in 5e at this point. I played multiple 5e games, though nothing extensive. None of my games have ever gone super, super deep, right? But it is a system that I feel like I have a lot of mastery over at this point, right? I guess I played up to like level 8 or 9. Is kind of the farthest up we went in one in one game, but it is, I guess at this point it's just sort of like the default, which is really what it comes down to, especially because so many people have sort of gotten their window from like kind of Critical Role, Dimension 20, these Let's Play podcasts, that it's given them sort of the Baldur's Gate. So there's a good example of this. It's just given them that sort of step in the direction that gets them to go, oh, I can understand. I can grok this system, essentially. Which is why I think it has sort of come to the default. But honestly, at this point, my position is that this is Coke and Pepsi. This is a metaphor I used when we were sort of talking about it over the weekend. At the end of the day, right, the difference to me between a Coke and a Pepsi, I have a preference. I prefer Pepsi. I like the taste of Pepsi over the taste of Coke, right? But like on a hot summer day, if I go to the stand at a baseball game and I order a drink and I go, can I get a Coke? And they go, Pepsi fine? Yes. The Pepsi is always okay. Or whatever. Go, whatever the other version of that is. I'm never in a position where my preference for one is so powerful that it overrules my sort of fundamentals when it comes to what I want at the end of the day, which is, I guess in D&D terms, a fun game of tabletop fantasy RPG with my friends, right? To me, all of the difference is covered in, I think of it like the margin of error, but really it's like the margin of like GMs, essentially. Like, you could probably convince me that 2E is better than 5E or 5E is better than 2E on some like marginal level, but it's always going to be overshadowed by this sort of strength and power of a good group, like a table with chemistry, right? An imaginative GM who is knowledgeable in this, like all of that kind of stuff is going to be just so much more important at the end of the day, than any of the fundamentals of the system. So that's kind of where I'm at. It's all the same. That's kind of my
So
position.
I am partially with you, right? I enjoy both systems. I am the type of person that will not have a Pepsi if I can't have a Coke. And so I
Maybe
feel
that's a bad example.
no, but I mean, like, I think that's part of it, though, right? Like, if you have a strong preference for one, I think that that's like fine and valid. I will say that, like, um, to your last point about like the more important things are group and GM. I think that's at the when choosing between PF2E and D&D 5e. I think yes, I'd much rather play a D&D 5 campaign with a DM that I know is good and a group that I know gels than I would a PF2E with like a bad group of people. But I do think there's kind of
not
like
even measuring against bad. But my thing is like I would take a good GM over an average GM every time. There's no value in my mind where the system is going to make the difference, right? If somebody says, "Hey, I'm starting a D&D game. It's in 5e or it's in 2e." There's no version of things probably, even though I mean I haven't played 2e, right? 2e could be dog shit and I could fucking hate it or something like that. But there's just like no version of things where I would turn down a good game with good people because of the system that it's in, essentially. And that to me is sort of like what I'm thinking of as kind of like the barrier,
so,
right?
so
I would turn down a good game, like a good game with a good table, if it was not, if it was in a system that I don't particularly like, or I think might be bad. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I
And
was gonna
so
say
that's
there
kind of
is
the
there is a bare minimum I think that you have to hit in order for 5e to or not in order for in order for like that all to work, right? Like
yeah.
I played a bunch of weirdly PBTA Powered by the Apocalypse games over the weekend, and they're good and they have their place, but like if my favorite GM came to me and said we're going to play an 8-year campaign of Powered by the Apocalypse, I'd be like, I don't know if I'm in for a long-term thing for that because like the system's
Yeah, I
fine.
100% agree with that.
Yeah,
You know what would be a good example of this? Star Wars. I don't think I really want to play that Star Wars game that we played. When we played that game for 2 years,
right.
I don't think I want to play that system again. I think I would probably say, I'm okay, no thanks, right? If somebody pitched me a game
I think
in that system, but
yeah, I think I'd play like a shorter thing, but I wouldn't play what we played again, essentially.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but I think that'll all get to like things like where I thought character advancement wasn't particularly good in that system, right? And so like that's why it doesn't lead to a longer term thing. But um, in terms of PF2E versus 5e, I think there is some value in getting into like the crunchy little details about what sets them apart because I also think that I can point to either you know not that Jason Bullman or I don't know John Wizards of the Coast.
Yeah,
I don't
it's
know.
not Mike Merles anymore. Who's the new guy?
Isn't
I've been
it?
watching these D&D interviews, but Mike Merles was the original guy.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm
Well, I
talking
mean, the
about?
original guy was Gary Gygax, right? But
No, sure. I mean, for fifth edition, the original guy was Mike Merles, and then I think he had like a sexual harassment scandal or something like that, and he got fired, or maybe he still works there.
oh,
He's just
Jeremy
not like
Crawford.
Jeremy Crawford might be the. Is he like he's balding a little bit, has very short blonde hair, has glasses. Is that him?
Glasses got a little pointy
Yeah.
thing.
Oh, this
Yeah.
little thing. Yeah. Okay. I've been watching interviews with this guy for like hours and hours of interviews because he's going over the new updates to the 2024 5.5 players handbook in these interviews on their YouTube channel. So yes, Jeremy Crawford would be probably the I don't know, the person we would consider to be the counterpart to Jason Bullman.
Right, and and there's other people in the PF2E world, right? Like Mark Seifter's name is on the player core too, even though he is, he is no longer like primarily employed by Paizo. He's like a Battle Zoo or like I forget the name of the Roll for Combat is the name of that company.
Okay.
But like point being is like Jeremy Crawford and Jason Bowman probably aren't listening to this podcast, right?
Yeah,
But
absolutely not.
theoretically, if I were to like go to each of them and be like, this is the thing that I like from your counterpart game, figure out like this is why it feels good, and maybe you consider doing it. I think that there's stuff in there from both sides, right?
Yeah.
On like,
And there may even be some new stuff, right? Like you didn't know about so you don't know anything about these 5.5 changes, right?
so I read some of like the patch notes. I mostly read through what they changed about the Fiend Warlock, because that's what I played in the campaign that just ended. Or in like some of the changes like that were highlighted by some of my friends playing their classes, right? Like for instance, friend of the cast Alexio, his character, he played a paladin, and they changed this, you can only smite once per turn, which makes sense. He was like doing hundreds of damage a turn, just like blasting out smites on the boss, right? Like
Yep.
or like the warlock, right? Like I was playing a fiend warlock. They, incredible to me, hurl through hell, didn't get a save, which made it fucking great. But they gave it a save, they reduced the damage, but they also made you able to use it more often. So balance changes type stuff, right? But that's all kind of like that's all finicky little details that like doesn't, with a couple exceptions that maybe I'll go into. Most of the stuff that I found there doesn't feel like it's like a thing that I would bring up in this podcast, as like a thing that I find is a difference that like feels good or bad.
Yeah, my bet is that weapon mastery would probably be the best example of that. That's like a new system that has been added on top, and they've also alluded to some other ones, but it's just the PHB first. In the DMG, they're introducing rules for what is called a bastion, which is the base of your it's like your home hub or whatever kind of thing. But they've been pretty cagey about this stuff because the DMG comes out after, the PHB is in September, the DMG I think is in December or something like that. So theoretically, I guess we'll learn more down the line. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't really like. I don't know how I feel about it. Just because like no, I mean that all makes sense, right? Like that, like because you were describing these weapon mastery changes to me, and these feel like in some way like traits and critical specialization effects that you get in PF2E. So I think that is
interesting. Okay, yeah,
that is an example of like some crossbleed between these two things, right?
Sure.
But do you want to just go through a couple different things that like I've seen that are different, and you can
so one of the things that is at the core of this, like for instance, advantage I think is a pretty huge aspect of 5e, right? You have advantage and disadvantage as pretty core components of how the system works. In my mind, the sort of transferable, like the Pathfinder equivalent of this is critical successes and critical failures, right? You have multiple levels of success and failure in 2e. Is all that correct?
So the things you identified are correct, although I would not directly compare them, but I see what you're getting at. Like I think like on the one hand, I think advantage is super elegant. I really like it for circumstantial stuff, especially. Yeah. I also think that it can be a little too like limiting, especially at higher levels, right? Like, if all you can ever do is grant advantage, then like you essentially go from this place where like everybody's kind of helping each other out, because if you can grant the other person advantage, then that's like, a big thing. But as you get more tools to grant advantage, you stop needing to rely on people so much. Like we got access to level 9 spells. Foresight is a level 9 spell. It gives you advantage on every attack, your opponent disadvantage on every attack against you, and like advantage on saves. It's a very powerful spell. It's 9th level. It lasts for 8 hours. But because of that, it kind of like flattens your interaction with the rest of the group, because you can't get any advantage on top of that, right? Like you have your advantage.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And you
it's
can't
not like you could get double advantage or advantage +2 or something, right? Like if you get two different instances of advantage, it's not like you get cumulative bonuses. You can just get it the one time.
Right.
That is a pretty binary thing. Yeah.
Not only that, but like it's not like, I think by Raw, it's not like if you have 2 advantage and 1 disadvantage, you get an advantage. It's if you have any source of disadvantage and any source of advantage, they just cancel each other out and you don't get anything on the roll, right? So it's tough to kind of play around those edges. Where, as in Pathfinder 2e, there's still numbers. There are a couple cases where you get something that it's obviously not called advantage. You get something that like gives you a reroll, but it's never to the extent that you do in 5e. And it's not trivial to stack bonuses. That was a big problem with 1e, is you could just like keep stacking bonuses on top of each other, and get like make it basically impossible to not hit. But part of the important thing there is, and this I do think brings in the levels of success aspect. In Pathfinder 2e, if you beat the DC by 10, it's a critical success, and if you miss the DC by more than 10, it's a critical failure. And so giving somebody a +1 not only increases your chance of hitting by 5%, it increases your chance of critting by 5%, and decreases your chance of critically failing by 5%, which is big, right? And so I feel like you are more encouraged to build around getting those numbers up, because the fighter can crit a bit easier. So like, you have somebody, so most kind of like combat style disadvantages have become a variation of what's called off guard, which is just a -2 to AC for the hit. So that keeps it from being like, oh, I trip him and I grapple him and I like, flank him, right? Those are all give you the same -2 and they don't stack. But you can like give a bless as a buff, or like a heroism as a buff, or some other type of thing. And so while you can't stack it super high, you can get enough there that it all kind of combines together to give you that kind of like push over the top. Obviously, none of the math has been done for like a cross system usage, but I think you could get something that's close to pretty ideal with this if you have PF2E's level of kind of like numerical ups and downs. But then for things that are like very circumstantial, you use the elegance of advantage disadvantage, right? By making it harder to just like mechanically give advantage or disadvantage like you currently have in 5e, you kind of encourage the kind of creative play that's like, oh, can I get advantage on this roll because I did X, Y, or Z? That it's not explicitly a mechanical effect in the game, but that you can, be like, oh, that's clever from the GM. Take an advantage.
Do you feel as though one of the things that I quite like about advantage is that elegance, right? Being able to make a snap call and go, great, you get an extra whatever to this, right? It sort of reminds me. I used to do this when I was a kid. I called it the badass bonus, which was a +2 that I would give out. This is in high school in 3-5 games. Right. Which was if somebody does something and it's particularly like fucking cool, they would get a +2. I would give them the badass bonus, right? That just represented a +2. And it actually kind of created this ecosystem where everybody is trying to sort of like, when you incentivize that kind of play, and now everyone's one-upping each other in order to try and like get that level of things. Maybe it would be similar to like granting like inspiration now.
Yeah.
Would maybe something.
I think mechanically you're supposed to grant inspiration for that, right? Like
Yeah. Like at this point, this is what you're. This was before any like. This was 2004, right? And I think that the advantage really communicates that in a really simple way. Oh, yes, you can get advantage on this roll by doing whatever. I have a book on. Do you remember in the last session I pulled a book out of the library that was on ancient lizardmen tomes? Can I get advantage on this history check because it's about the lizardmen? Yes, I'm happy to grant that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. So I think that's slightly different than inspiration, but like I think it's the same thing, right? Like it's like the badass bonus, instead of being a +2 on this roll, is like a token that you can cash in for an advantage at an arbitrary time. Although I don't think that's I think you're supposed to tie your inspiration roll to like, deep-seated character motivations. In practice for me, it's just kind of been like, I really want to succeed at this roll because it's important. I'm cashing in my inspiration. And at some point, my GM was like, fine, right? Like, but I think that works. Although Pathfinder also has hero points, which are effectively inspiration. Although it has, maybe I'll go into this now. Hero points, I think, are worse than inspiration. And that's because they have this extra effect, which is you can spend all of your hero points to like stop yourself from dying. And so the problem is you incentivize people to hold on to one hero point and never spend it, right? Because it's like the both 2E games that I've played in have tried doing certain ways, like doing things to like fix that problem. which has been like, essentially we have a 2-tiered version of hero points, like one that's dedicated to saving your ass, but that only refreshes every level, whereas like the normal one refreshes every session.
Oh man, that's actually Warhammer. Warhammer works that way because Warhammer has what are called fate points, right? And fortune points. And fate points are you can spend it in order to not die, right? If something would kill you, brings you to 1 HP or something like that. But every session, I think you get fortune points equal to the number of fate points you have banked, right? Which I also really loved because it creates this like investment sort of strategy of like, okay, well, if I bank 3 fate points for a long, long time, I actually still get to kind of like accrue debt on those
right,
because I can get a bunch of fortune points and then use them for shitty things. Because fortune points, I think, were just like re-roll a skill check, like that kind of dumb shit, right?
right.
And I think that there's something there. So, what's the advantage of inspiration in your eyes? Is that because inspiration doesn't have that sort of negative, like canceling out sort of thing, you don't get that, I don't know, like Skyrim potion problem where
Yeah,
you just hoard it.
yeah. No,
Okay.
I think exactly because it lacks that functionality, it's better because it kind of encourages you to spend it. I will say that this is maybe the toughest thing that all of my GMs have had in terms of like giving out extra inspiration has been, what like it's just like not very common, right? Like in my 5e game happened, I think, over the course of the 8 years that we played the game, I think I could count on one hand the number of times it was given out. And it wasn't just like, used, like it got used during the session, but it didn't really get given out. One of the games I'm playing in, because like the DMG says, or I guess it's called the GM core or whatever now, because it says it should be given out about once an hour. Because he wasn't doing it, he was like, okay, what we're gonna do is that you look very surprised there. Is this
That's a lot. That's really fast, right? That's 3 times over the course of like a 3-hour session, right?
Yeah. Because that wasn't happening, what he did is he made a pool, and then every hour a point went in the pool, and anybody could use it. And very recently, he changed it so that no one can use more than 1 point from the pool during a session.
Oh, interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
so you don't have one person just like, yeah.
Yeah, I think I didn't perceive it as being particularly a problem, but like there were certain
That's
characters.
like the kind of thing that I would do that would piss like Nick off or something, right? Like I would take a hero point in order to like get a good charisma check for some RP bullshit, and then like Nick, who is just standing in, I'm sorry, Nick, you don't deserve this later. And then Nick would get mad because that hero point was not in the pool for like,
Fishing for a
making an
crit.
attack roll hit. Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah, exactly.
Something that I do think is interesting about both systems is that in practice, like I think in theory, you can use it to either roll with advantage or re-roll a failed roll, or technically it's re-roll a roll before when you see the number on the die but don't know the result. In practice, it's been kind of a little bit more flexible on that end, right? Like
you have to like call objection like immediately because the moment that somebody rolls a die and you see the number the GM wants to go, you fail, right? Like
I will say in practice it's not so bad because like or rather in practice at the table it's not so bad because you can generally it's like, oh, a 5 came up on the face, right? Like maybe I want to re-roll that. It's bad in Foundry, which I like as a system, but if you've got it set up right, it'll just tell you what the result is.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is great for like keeping the game moving, but like bad for that specific problem. But in what's it say? In my experience, the hero points get used less for rolling with advantage and more for re-rolling failed checks or re-rolling bad checks, which at some level I think is maybe a mistake because rolling with advantage always feels good. Re-rolling a 5 into a 2 feels terrible, right? Because I believe in both systems, you have to take the second result. And it's not like, like I said, because of that like fuzziness, it's rarely ever you're rolling from a success into a failure. But it also feels like you wasted your resource, right? Like that. which I don't think is the worst thing in the world. It's just a pain in the butt.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, there are some changes to inspiration in the new 5.5. One thing is that you can use it on any die. It's no longer just d20s, so you can re-roll your damage, which I think is kind of neat. And then you also no longer need to use it before rolling, is what the rule says, which I did not. Is like I don't know what that means. I'm just looking at the patch notes. It says heroic inspiration used to re-roll any die immediately after rolling it. No longer uses just d20s, and you no longer need to use it before rolling. So hey.
Yeah. No, I guess maybe by Raw you were supposed to use it before the roll, but
Yeah, I don't think anybody ever did that shit. So.
Yeah. A lot of these 5.5 patch notes seem to be a canonization of common player practice in the first place.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny because one of the things they'll talk about in the interviews that I've been watching, Jeremy Crawford and whoever the other guy is that's like interviewing him, they'll talk quite a lot about the way that they sent these surveys out, these satisfaction surveys to people who'd been playing 5th edition, and tracking, what scores high on like the satisfaction survey, right? So for instance, rogues score very high on the satisfaction survey when they rogue sneak attacks, right? Like that's like a satisfying class. Monks were an unsatisfying class. Rangers were an unsatisfying class. And so like that's why essentially monk and ranger both got kind of reworked, but rogue got kind of just like a little tuning.
That makes sense. Another big difference that I want to highlight that I think Pathfinder does better is the action system, right? The Pathfinder.
Okay. This feels like the big one. This one you always mention.
Yeah. This. Okay. As I have been, and I think it also pairs with a couple other things, but at front, right? D&D has this move, standard, bonus, or move standard action. I don't know if it's your action, right? Move, action, bonus, with freeze, which is also very similar to the PF1E of standard, move, swift. Which was, I don't know. I read through some old stuff. I'm like, oh my god, this was terrible, right? Like full actions and whatnot. Like, I much prefer Pathfinder you have 3 actions. You can spend them how you want. Spells are typically 2 actions. An attack is 1, but if you attack more than once in a round, you take a penalty. Moving's an action. And I think it's very elegant. I think it works really well. And it lets you kind of make decisions on the fly, right? Like if your spell fails, maybe you want to move, or maybe you want to try and hit them with your sword instead of necessarily having to move. Or, maybe if you need to move twice, you can still get an attack in at the end of it, or cast a 1-action spell if you have access to it. I don't think it's perfect. Like one of the things that I thought was like pretty cool that they did is they have scaling spells that scale the number of actions you take. But I think for the most part, those kind of fall flat on their faces with a couple exceptions. Like Magic Missile, it fires an additional missile for every action you take to cast it. I don't think I've seen anybody ever cast it with less than 3 actions, because it's
why would you even bother?
Yeah.
Right?
The only thing that I think that works well with that is heal, and that's because the 2-action heal is a strong single target heal, whereas the 3-action heal is an AOE heal. And so
you can see how those are 2 different
use
fundamental abilities, basically. Yeah.
The 1-action heal is like a touch quick heal, but that's too valuable. Like I rarely ever see anybody use the 1-action heal unless it's like a dire emergency situation. But I think that the system in general works super well. And it makes combat super fluid and gives you a ton of options of what to do with things. And kind of makes play a little bit more customizable in that way. Although you do get pieces of it. Like I know that the fighter at my table in the 5e game I played had access to superiority die or whatever. Lou in the chest says that sounds like discouragement for casters in regards to ever moving. Most spells are 2 actions to cast, not 3. So
because this is one of the things I quite like about the 2e. So here's my 5e system take on the actions. I like this setup. I think it's straightforward, it's elegant, and it removes the stuff that I hated about Pathfinder, right? Like the difference between a full attack and an attack is catastrophic in Pathfinder, but they just get rid of that in D&D, right? If you're a fighter, if you're a level 20 fighter, you have a full attack. You can, I think every attack action you take is 3 attacks, but you still have your move. You still have a bonus, right? You can do all this other sort of stuff.
Yeah. And it's, and those 3 attacks are also at your maximum attack bonus, correct? Like you don't take the malice. And some of that's just numbers, and so like, I think it works either way if you're like playing across it, because I think the idea for a, like say, a fighter in 2e is that you use 1 action to hit and it'll probably crit because it's very strong. Use a 2nd action to hit and you might hit, but you probably won't crit with it because it's at -5. And then the 3rd action is that if you use it to hit, it's a Hail Mary because it's at -10. But most of the time you're using that to like move or maybe like do a maneuver of some sort. Something else useful you can do with your action instead of, or like raise a shield, right? Because that's also an action. Stuff like that. So I think it works out. I think it works out super well, and I think that scaling just like.
Do you ever worry about people taking like, so for instance, the reason that the bonus action is sort of like interesting is it creates a sort of problem that clever sort of crunchy players can solve, right? So for instance, I'm a fighter and I'm obviously doing so much of my stuff with my like, my main action, but now I have this bonus action that is sort of, there's kind of an opportunity cost associated with it, right? What do I do with my bonus action is kind of an interesting kind of question to get at and get after. A monk can use a bonus action to flurry of blows, right? Or to disengage or to dash or whatever else, right? Whereas a I don't know, like a barbarian, the berserker, right, has a bonus action where they can do another attack, right? So you can kind of get an extra attack in as a berserker classed subclass barbarian by using your bonus action for this kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of questions about like, okay, well, what am I going to use for that sort of thing, right? And I think what the fear does, if we just sort of flatten all of this to attacks, it's sort of the same thing that happens with advantage a little bit, right? Which is like, oh, well, all actions are equivalent. So what do I do with my extra action? Well, I just attack again, right? I just keep attacking. That kind of thing.
I think that's part of why the scaling down is important, right? Like the stacking malice means that like you're probably good on the first 2 if you're very good at attacking. If you're not, you're probably good with the first one.
But the 3rd one is you're gonna get. It's like, why even bother?
Yeah, it's only if like you really have nothing better to do. I also found that like most bonus actions, at least that I saw in 5e, were kind of used on the same thing. Like you were maybe using it for like an extra. Like if you were a barbarian, it was almost always used on the extra attack, right?
Yep.
If you're a fighter, it was, a maneuver of some sort, like the one in my group used shield bash a lot, right? And so it didn't feel super different, although sometimes things got changed.
Yeah, like I imagine if you're playing a rogue, you're playing a monk, you're using bonus actions on this extra shit, and like neat, rogues can dash. I think is a bonus action.
Dash, disengage, or
disengage.
Sneak maybe. I know they
hide?
get.
Yeah. I think it's hide. I think they can make a hide check, right? And I think all that stuff is like theoretically neat, but my bet is that you kind of fall into a routine. But I also think that that's kind of like normal and sort of like fine to a certain extent. And one of the things is like, okay, when you have multiple competing bonus actions, what do you do? So for instance, this has come up with people talking about the Ranger. The Beast Mastery Ranger was famously apparently sucked super bad. The Beast Mastery Ranger, everybody clowned on it. I don't know any of this. This is what like I have read in sort of like 5e kind of, I don't know, meta threads, maybe you would call it. And because the only way that you could make an attack with your animal companion is by you using the attack action to make it attack, right? So you don't get your own you don't get your own attack until like level 9 or something, where when you take an attack action, you can also give it to your animal companion, that kind of thing. And that's one of the things that's changing, right? They're changing it to, okay, well, if you're a Beast Mastery Ranger, now ordering your animal companion is a bonus action. So you essentially get an extra attack. You now get to you attack and then bonus action animal attacks, right? Okay, cool, right? But it creates this thing of, well, not hunters, rangers always, also want to be using hunter's mark or whatever it's called, quarry or something like that, right? The spell that applies a thing, it just makes you do extra damage when you land your attacks, right? That's a bonus action, right? So now you're sort of competing for the bonus action for, okay, well, we buffed hunter's quarry. Hunter's quarry is how a ranger gets their damage as sort of a damage dealing kind of like class, right? But it competes with using the bonus action in this way, right? And I think that I don't know. I think that the mechanics around that are I don't know, maybe interesting. That's the best argument I can
No,
really
I mean,
supply.
and I think the same thing happens in PF2E. It's just a little bit more generalizable, right? Like,
Yeah.
very honestly, that bonus action thing sounds like they just took what Pathfinder does, which is it's it's one action. If you have a pet or like a summon, you can spend one action and give your minion 2 actions. I think for animal companions it might work slightly differently. I don't quite remember, but for like summons specifically, I know this pretty well. You spend one of your actions, it gives them 2 actions, which can be move and a bite, or if they're in a position like two attacks, or if they've got like special abilities that take up multiple actions, that kind of thing. But like I think that's where kind of like this works, right? Like if I'm a ranger, and I'm in position such that I don't need to move, I can spend my standard on, or I can spend one action on an attack, one on like I guess the ranger spells work slightly differently, but something like identify monster,
Hunter's
right?
mark, yeah, exactly, yeah, whatever.
And then one on commanding my animal. Whereas if I do need to move, I give up one of those and I make that choice, right? Like,
yeah.
And I think that lets things be a little bit more dynamic. And
I definitely like the idea, for instance, that I can disengage, and that's just an action. Under basically 0 circumstances, if I'm playing a barbarian, am I ever disengaging, right? Giving up my attack for a turn to disengage, that sucks so bad, right?
Right. Yes.
But I could see a situation where, okay, I have 3 actions. Oh, I can disengage. I can get whatever. I can move 10 feet behind me to this guy with my disengage action and then attack him twice. That feels much more sort of applicable, right? And maybe like you could make some sort of argument around like monks and rogues get easy access to disengage, whereas barbarians don't. And so you are supposed to stay in melee. You're a fucking barbarian, right? You're not supposed to be hopping around ping-ponging between whatever, and if you do, you're gonna take a AOs kind of thing. But that's a pretty bad argument in my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting because part of the reason that doesn't play out the same in Pathfinder is for 2 reasons. One is that disengage isn't a full move, right? It's step like it was it's a 5-foot step like it was in first edition, right?
Okay, cool.
And that's like, but the bigger thing is that AOs aren't on everybody, and they're not nearly as common.
I didn't think about that. That's also true. Yeah.
Like reactions are actually fairly valuable as a resource. I think, and there are some alternate uses for reactions in 5e, but in my experience, it's a lot more common for a reaction to be one, you don't have an AOO, so you have to use it on something else, but like also a little bit more closely guarded, right? Like raising a shield doesn't actually have to do on a turn. You can block with it and prevent damage, but that is your reaction on your turn. If you do that, you cannot use an AOO unless you get another reaction from somewhere else, right? So
yeah. Technically that's true in D&D, but nobody ever uses reactions that way in 5e, right? It's just like the number of a reaction sort of spells or abilities are just so small in comparison to an AOO, and the value of an right.
Unless you've got like they are like mutually exclusive. In my experience, they're mutually exclusive kind of situations, right? Like if I get hit at range, maybe I use Fire Rebuke as my reaction, but like if I'm doing that, I'm probably not in melee, or if I am in melee, I'm going to hold it anyway for an AOO if I need to use it.
Yeah. Do you find that combat is more bouncy in Pathfinder because people don't have as many AOs? You find people moving around and bouncing between enemies or something?
I wouldn't necessarily call it bouncy. I mean, there's some amount of that because like it's a river that flows both ways, right? Like you also have a harder time locking down enemies, um, uh,
Oh yeah.
from you because like basically fighters are the ones that get it early, and everybody else gets like some amount of it, um, or some amount of like reaction. But like if you know you have smart enemies that want to like dive bomb your casters, they kind of can, but in practice it doesn't happen as much. I would say that it's not particularly bouncy. But that also might just kind of be like muscle memory, right? Like there aren't a lot of people like doing crazy moves. It just kind of like lets you if you need to, right? Like I also found that like D&D 5e wasn't particularly not bouncy. Towards the end in our game, like people were willing to like eat AOs, right? Because it's
Yeah.
not like, you know, it's usually a weapon hit. It's not like, you know, the full attack from the fighter, right? And in very few instances could somebody do something crazy a on one of those on a reaction attack. So it was a penalty, but not a severe one. So maybe that balances out in the end. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. So something I do want to talk about, this kind of came up when it came to, so front of the cast, Mark was talking about it. He basically brought up this comparison between a 5e fighter and a 2e fighter. I obviously don't know what a 2e I know pretty well what a 5e fighter looks like, but I don't really know very well what a 2e fighter looks like. What's your kind of philosophy when it comes to sort of the class progression? Do you think there's a meaningful difference between the two?
Um. Yes, and like in a way that's like I don't know if I'd like how I could like even. This is maybe a thing about like class design between the two games in general, right? Like we're talking about this action system earlier, right? Like some of the thing you're also not seeing is that every character is going to have things they can do, right? A monk can attack twice with one action. They both, you take your multi-attack penalty on it, but you can get more attacks out. Most like marshals get like some sort of ability that's like, or the opportunity to take a feat that's like, two actions, a an attack, either two attacks for like a double slice feat, or like an attack and a combat maneuver. Combat maneuvers also have the attack trait, so they also take your multi attack penalty. But it's attack and a maneuver, and they are both at your highest multi attack penalty. Like neither takes it. They both take the malice that is at that moment, and then you get two penalties on your third attack if you take it, right? So it'd be like, two at 0 and one at -10 if you wanted to do 3. Um, uh, but those are all the like the things that go into like making that action economy work, right? And making it work like this is part of the thing that I think separates the class design out fundamentally from 5e to PF2e. 2e feels a little bit more fluid to me, right? You've got more options that you can pick at a granular level, right? I feel like a Pact of the Tome warlock feels very similar to other Pact of the Tome warlocks across game, or like a Battle Master, I think that's the right term, fighter will feel very similar to a different Battle Master paladin, because you kind of like get things in packages, right? Like you get you have some sub option picks, but like they're like variations on a theme, and then once you get higher level, you get enough choices out of your option slots that you start coalescing around, and beyond the kind of like and pick this option because this is the best one type stuff, right? Like you still get enough choices that you like things start to look a bit similar, whereas in PF2E there is a lot of choice, especially with archetypes that let you have two different fighters diverge, right? There are some clear paths, right? Like a fighter, there's pretty clearly a sword and board option. There's a sword and board set of feats. There's a two-handed set of feats. There's maybe a ranged set of feats, and I think there's like a one-hand empty set of feats type deal. And you could roll straight down that one, and maybe that would look very similar to somebody else taking all those same feats. But in that level category, there's also like a more general feat that you could take if you wanted to. Like something like like a kind of standard bonus, or like maybe you want to grab a maneuver feat instead of like the other feat in your kind of like
Yeah, and now your thing is tripping and also hitting, right?
Yeah. And on top of that, you've got the archetype options. I think part of this too is that a lot of people play with the free archetype variant, which essentially you get at every other level, you get a free feat but that has to be spent on an archetype as opposed to more class feats. I think this largely works because archetypes give you more breadth than they do depth. It's not like you're stacking bonuses like you would be in like Pathfinder 1E. So you can so like let's say I want to be for instance I'm playing a game with friend of the cast Mark where let's not use that one because that character maybe has a specific problem. But in my long running 2E game, I am playing a cleric of Abadar who is kind of a war priest, and one of his archetypes is Hell Knight, which is a lot of flavor, and it gives you some specific abilities like ability to wear heavy armor, bonuses on damage reduction, right? A lot of stuff that like and like some combat maneuvers that gives me a lot of stuff that's like makes me feel like a Hell Knight in addition to being a cleric, right? A war priest. Or one of his other archetypes, because one of his other archetypes is Marshal, which is kind of like battlefield commander shouting, like giving people bonuses, that kind of thing. And I think that works well to kind of like make a very diverse set of characters. I think there's maybe a little bit of an issue with free. Like I think the game is best with free archetype, but it's also not really balanced around it entirely. And not that it causes huge problems, but it causes like weird problems. But that's a little bit too into the nitty gritty for me to really go into. But
yeah, so in D&D you have your class and you have your subclass, right? But you are essentially picking, it is like packages, right?
Right, yeah.
It reminds me a lot of like talent points, right?
Yeah.
In like WoW, you have your class, then you have your spec, and at the end of the day, most arms warriors are going to play pretty similarly, even if like I don't know if your trees are like this. The arms tree, you kind of have the left side of the tree, which is like bleeds and mortal strike proficiency. You have the middle side, center of the tree, which is cooldowns, Colossus Smash and Blade Storm, and then you have the right side of the tree, which is like execute. But like at the end of the day, you're blending through all three of those, and like you're still using mostly stuff. So there's just not a lot of difference between like an arms warrior in WoW terms to other arms warriors, right?
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. That's pretty interesting. That definitely makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I think is actually a little bit sort of interesting.
Really quickly, just in defense of that type of system, I think that's a weakness of 5e, but I also think it's a thing where like I spent 8 years playing one character in 5e. It would be more years than I have life left in me for me to like have to repeat a character and be like, oh, this again, right? So I don't think. I think it's more a conceptual problem than it is a real problem. So I do want to say that in favor of if the archetype that you want to play, like, and I don't mean like mechanical archetype. I mean like if the character archetype in the kind of metaphorical literary sense is well served by one of the subclasses in 5e, I think you're going to have a good time playing that class and you're going to hit it pretty well, which I think is a good thing. I think the cost of pay for that is less
flavor of the zealot barbarian, right? Which is a barbarian whose rage is sort of like divinely tinged with the gods and stuff like that, right? I think there are a lot of people who understand, like, oh, I'm going to play the mad preacher zealot, whatever, and here is a class subclass combination that I can go for that, and I'll add the whatever background, and I'll add the disciple background, and I'll add he'll be a dwarf, and he's going to be just this raving that's a character archetype that I think is very well served, right?
Yeah.
By I don't know, this set of circumstances, whereas like maybe I would say yeah, well, now I'm kind of trying to.
The thing is that all the big ones are handled pretty well, right? Like,
yeah, I'm trying. Like, what's like a weird ass archetype that isn't supported in D&D? I'm sure like that's not like this isn't a gotcha. I'm just now thinking of all of the obvious ones that are, because I'm trying to think of the ones that are not obvious, right?
Right. Yeah. No. Like if you wanted to play maybe like a gun kata monk, right? Like
Yeah. Yes. Sure.
Right. Or like
yes. A phalanx warrior. This is a great example. A phalanx warrior, right? Phalanx warrior was this is a 1E thing. In first edition Pathfinder, there was a fighter archetype called Phalanx Warrior, which was quite literally King Leonidas. Okay, you got proficiency in tower shields, and you could use two-handed polearms in like wield them one-handed, right? So you could have a pike and you could have a tower shield, and that was like the whole thing. And your whole class was about fighting like King Leonidas from the movie fucking 300. And you could tell somebody had the idea, I want to make a character that's King Leonidas from the movie 300. You cannot make this character in D&D 5e. It would be impossible to select a set of choices. There's no like combination of class, subclass feats that would get you to that sort of playable archetype in the same way in 5e. Is that a good comparison?
Yeah, no, I think it is, right? Like,
okay.
Maybe yes. No, that is about right. And you can like, and on some level, right? Like, on the other side of this equation is like before they came out with the Magus, building a kind of like, a fight wizard was not easy to do in a way that felt super satisfying, right? Like I built this punch wizard, right, in 2E before the Magus came out. It was based around like buffing himself and then doing unarmed strikes, and it kind of worked, but it didn't have like it wasn't as good as like the Eldritch Knight in 5e. I think the Magus fills that role really well, but you had to wait for someone to write that, right? For those, like, there are these like specific mechanics that make certain concepts work that you have to wait for someone to build in 2e, which are like already handled in 5e because they're like, that was like enough of a thing that somebody wanted it. But if you wanted to like do a half decent job of that in 2e, you still could. Whereas you could, like, if there was no Eldritch Knight in 5e, I don't think you'd get that kind of like, fighty wizard as good, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely does make sense. Like I would say, 90% of players' barbarian archetypes are probably covered by the subclasses, right? In whatever in 5e. But like it definitely requires you to sort of opt in, kind of whole hog into a sort of like a character fantasy to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense. That is actually a pretty interesting sort of approach. The other thing I want to talk about was sort of ancestries. D&D calls them species now. I fucking hate that so much, but whatever.
Yeah, it is what it is.
They also changed backgrounds. This is probably the only change in 5.5e that I'm personally mad about, because backgrounds used to give you a cool sort of benefit that was like an out of combat RP benefit, essentially. So for instance, the background for smuggler is that in any town, like any city or something, right, like above 5,000, like a city, you can find a safe house, right? I love this. Is like catnip. This is maybe the thing that I would describe about 5e that I kind of love the most, actually, is that there's a lot of bullshit in 5e where there's just like, oh yeah, sure, like this is some like RP whatever, take it, right? Thieves' Cant would be a good example of this, right? Rogue as a class feature can speak fucking rogue with each other, and that's cool. I think that's neat, right? I was wondering, is there are there equivalent, sort of things in Pathfinder? Do you find that Pathfinder's sort of crunchiness that you were describing a little bit before keeps it away from these sorts of, I don't know, just flavorful whatever additions?
So I think it's a little bit worse than 5e. I will say that 5e probably has the edge on this. Because the way that manifests is you get a lore skill, and lore skills can be like, useless or like useful, but it's also like not like lore skills are supposed to be kind of like lesser knowledge skills. And occasionally they come in handy, especially if you've tuned it well to the campaign you're running. But it's also kind of like not like it doesn't have that same kind of level of like fluff that you get out of the 5e background. So I do think that that's something that 5e does a little bit better. I think the ancestries are stronger, but I also think that but I think that's like it's I think the ancestries are stronger because you get like essentially an ancestry advancement track, right? Because you get racial or ancestral, I guess, feats at like levels, and they're like things that you would expect, right? Like, the gnomes get better at like, being, curious, you know. Actually, this is the thing that makes me slightly mad. Is kobolds used to have a bunch of dragon powers, and it got moved to like a shared dragonborn heritage, and so like you don't get dragon's breath on kobolds directly anymore. You have to take the universal heritage that like maybe your DM won't let you take. I love kobolds so as a race, so but like
Sure.
I also think part of this too is that Wizards of the Coast treats D&D kind of like its redheaded stepchild, right? It doesn't make as much money as Magic. Who the fuck cares, right? Like, whereas Paizo, this is their only thing. So, there's tons of support for, like, like in the Player Core 2, hobgoblins are our race or an ancestry, right? I think it's called Rage of the Wild was like the last book before they did the remasters. Minotaur is a new ancestry. No, it's
Are they
Call of the
large size?
Wild.
Are they large size?
I don't know
That'd
if
be wild.
I don't know if the Minotaurs are large. It's Howl of the Wild. But I think Centaurs are. Hold
Oh,
on.
okay. Yeah, I have always been waiting for. I mean, they added Goliaths to 5e as like a core race, which I've always found neat. I think Goliaths are cool. But one of the things is that they're not. They used to be Goliaths used to be large, except they were five. They took up a 5 foot square, right? Which had some stupid. I
Yeah.
think it was called like powerful build or something like that. But they changed the way that works essentially. So now it's like Goliaths are medium, but they can sort of while not stretch out, become large as like a bonus action on a certain number of times per, like long rest essentially.
Minotaurs
Um,
are large.
okay, very cool.
Yeah. Um, yeah. This source book also has awakened animals in it, so you can play your furry adventures.
Oh
Um,
yeah, we talked about that on the cast like
yeah, yeah.
not
Oh,
too
yeah,
long
yeah.
ago.
When it came out, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah. Um, I think I I think part like I said, I think part of it is just there's more 2e content than there is 5e content.
Yep.
And so you just some if 5e content was coming out at the same rate as the 2e content, I think there'd maybe be a little bit more of a conversation about like archetypes that aren't being like well held.
Yep.
I think part of this is also part of the reason why I like 2e better is like I like doing weird things, right? Like,
Yeah.
I played a warlock and I didn't take Eldritch Blast for all 17 levels because I wanted to be like a dwarf with like a hammer, and like that's how I used like Green Flame Blade. And I think actually in the new 5.5 some of the invocations apply to any cantrip, not just Eldritch Blast, so like,
Yep.
you get a little bit more flexibility there, so I like that, but like sometimes that felt like I was playing with my hand tied behind my back a little bit, right? Like I should have taken Eldritch Blast, right? Like it's the cantrip that everybody takes, right? Like, um, uh, whereas in 2e, I feel like it's a little bit more accepting of that weirdness, right? It's like, yeah, sure, you can do it. Maybe you won't be the best at it, but it'll work, right? Like, um, your hand put together Gishi Mage works, or Gish Cleric works, right?
Yeah, so the last thing I wanted to ask a little bit about was like items and stuff. One of the things that 5e does, right? You can only attune to 3 different magic items. The magic items are typically much weaker than they were sort of in Pathfinder. How do you feel about that stuff? What's your
There's definitely more gearing options in 2e. Like there's a limit, but it's like 12 instead of 3.
yeah?
And you can get more with like a feat, with like a general feat. Um, uh, and it's not like there were the core 7 or whatever or core 9 in 1e, which is like,
Yeah, it was
well,
like everybody gets belt of giant strength and
yeah,
amulet of natural armor, that stuff.
yeah. So it's not nearly that bad, right? Like, and they also technically got rid of the slotting, so like, if you want to put on like 4 rings, you can, right? Like, it's just kind of subject to reasonability, right? It's like GM probably won't let you put on 3 different hats, but like it's not like, if you have a mask
You want to
and
do 2 belts?
yeah, 2 belts are like a mask and a hat, right? Whereas before that would technically take the head slot, right? Like,
Right. Okay.
um, obviously all subject to GM discretion and whatnot. But It's allows for a little bit more flexibility, but part of this is because the items are so much more powerful. I think it's harder to homebrew a thing that feels unique, right? Like
Mm.
in the 5e campaign I played in, my character got a weapon called the Blackstone Hammer, which was like this like specific item that I got, and it gave me a +1, and it let me recharge a spell slot as an action, right? Um, like that's pretty good for a 5e weapon, but it's also like tame enough that you can like, come up with that on the fly and not break anything, right? Um, in order to do that with a 2e item, it's a little bit tougher, and there's the same kind like because you are expected to get as many items as you are, you kind of get the like again, hate to pick on friend of the cast Nick, but like there was a moment in one game where he's like, I don't want to take this rune because I want the optimal rune, which I should be able to find at some point, right? Like, which is back in a 1e game. But like,
Oh my god, yeah, I remember this, right? Like we didn't want to take the cool dagger of whatever because a flaming dagger,
yeah,
like a +1 flaming
that,
dagger is mathematically better, and I might as well just, yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
I remember that
yeah,
very
yeah,
well.
yeah. But like that kind of thing, it's not as bad in 2e as it was in 1e, but you still get kind of that, right? It's like, um, coming up with like a balanced rune that's like a little bit unique is tougher because there are so many options that are already there. It's good if you don't want to think of something, but if you want to give your players a thing that like feels a little bit more unique, it's a little harder to kind of balance around the math. Although there might be rules in the DMG that kind of attack that a little bit better. I
Okay.
just haven't read through it. I should read through that at myself at some point. Um, yeah. So I think it's kind of like I want to call it a draw there between the two editions. Just like two different ways of approaching it that both have their benefits and their drawbacks. There was a
Yeah, I
thing.
really like the idea of 3 attunements, right? Of really kind of
Hmm.
saying, you know what, most of the power is coming from your level ups. You can accentuate your power in different sort of ways, right? Maybe you take bracers of armor, maybe you take I don't know, whatever, like the cloak of elven kind or something like that, right? But at the end of the day, right, like you don't need to rely on your items to grant you big plus bonuses because it's not always you don't necessarily have sort of the leeway in order to make that work. And I also think it makes it feel more kind of like special when you do get a magic item because it's only one of it's one of 3, right? Whereas 12, man, that is like an infinite number of items. It
Yeah,
feels like it's so many.
part of it. So I will say that it's not like all like it's not all bonuses. Like the kind of mandatory ones are your armor and weapon runes, but like that's kind of fine, and it also isn't true for all classes. Um, but it's kind of just like options most of the time, right? Like I've got like bracers of deflection and like a ring of the ram and a ring of fire resistance, right? Like I do make my character feel a little bit different, right? Because I'm a defensive character, and I feel like I've been stacking on defenses, and I play differently than like the glass cannon gunslinger in the group. Um, but it does. But I do see what you're saying. I do think that that's a valid point in 5e's direction. Um, I do want to talk about a thing that I think that PF2E does super well specifically,
Okay.
which is the and maybe we could talk about the thing that I think it's on the 5e side of this as well. But on the 2e side, save or suck spells, right? Um, in 5e, the way that this works is if the thing makes it save, you get nothing out of it, and you've wasted your action. And if you target a legendary creature, they can just decide to save, right? Like that's legendary resistance, which I do want to talk about legendary actions too, because I have less of a problem with them but legendary resistance always just felt kind of like a screw job to me. Um,
Yep.
uh,
Seems bad.
the way that 2e does it is you have your save or suck spell, and the creature gets a save. On a critical success, nothing happens to them. On a success, they get a version of the penalty that like I'll use a very concrete example. Hold monster versus paralyze. Paralyze is a 2e version. On a success, they are I believe they're stunned 1. which means that they on a critical success they don't get affected. On a success they are stunned 1, which means they lose an action and they don't get they can't react. They can't use their reaction until their turn. On a failure, they are stunned 3, which means they lose
Their whole next turn.
their whole next turn unless they're like hasted or something, right? They lose 3 actions. And then on a critical failure, you get this classic suck effect. It's like they are stunned 3 for a minute, and they get a save at the end of each round, which I think specifically solves a 1-8 problem. But like that balance, I think, feels so much better than the way Hold Person works, which is like if they make their save, nothing happens. If they lose it, they're held and they get a save, or like if I forget what the exact rules are, but they get saves, and you might lose the effect. And I think it works perfectly. And on top of that, the way you solve the kind of like stunning the boss monster thing is these kind of Savers Like spells have a tag called Incapacitation. And if you target a creature, I can't remember if it's your level or above your level. It's either your level and above or above your level. If you target with them or target them with an incapacitation effect, they automatically get 1 save higher. So
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it works super well. You fight something around your level that's maybe a little bit weaker, you can get these spells off and have the devastating effects. You don't really throw them at the boss creature unless you're kind of desperate, right? Or like it's like an area thing, and like maybe you include them just on the off chance they really fuck up their save or something. I think that works fantastically, and I think that's like, I think it's, for casters at least, that might be the single best improvement in 2e for like that kind of thing. I think it's, or maybe not the best, but it's like the most elegant solution in 2e that I think works phenomenally. And I think it's also enabled by the 10 up, 10 down, critical fails, critical success thing. So
yeah, yep, absolutely. That's really interesting. Okay. Okay, you said that there's a version of this that is applicable in 5e. What's that? What is that?
So in terms of like the incapacitation part, I think it's legendary resistance and legendary actions.
Okay.
I understand why legendary resistance exists, but it feels bad. Legendary actions I think are usually good. There were a couple of times.
I don't even, to be fair, I don't even fucking know what legendary actions are. So what are legendary actions?
So powerful monsters, in between player turns, can take a legendary action, and it's particular to each monster, right? For instance, in the final fight of the campaign, we were fighting this ancient black dragon, and her legendary actions were like she could like get an extra swipe, or she could like unleash a breath attack in between rounds, and it made it really tough, but I think it worked fine. There were times earlier in the campaign where legendary actions got used to move around, which specifically moving felt worse because it felt like you couldn't tactically respond.
Interesting. You get yourself into position and then they move out, and then you get yourself into position again, but they keep
they can move not only on their turn but in between turns, right?
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
And maybe the GM just recognized that felt really bad and stopped using it for those options. But towards the end of the campaign, it was mostly just extra attacks, which felt fair and felt like we knew what we were doing. It felt like we knew what we were getting into, but it was still like terrifying. And that's, I think that version of legendary actions, I think I'm going to put that as a point in D&D 5e's corner, because the way 2e does it is it gives monsters like, the same way that like a fighter can get, tripping an attack on 2 actions. They get more powerful versions of that kind of thing as they get to higher level. But it's not quite as terrifying as the legendary actions. And I think that the legendary actions, like, because you can just not use legendary actions. Like, if you wanted to turn something that was a powerful foe into a mook, you just don't use the legendary actions, right? Or use like the non-legendary version of that creature. Basically, only one creature in a fight is going to have the legendary actions on it. Whereas in 2e, you can't you can't pull that power off. It's always baked into the creature. And I think the way that ends up filtering out is that it's harder to do like single entity boss creatures. you kind of have to have like group fights with mooks, at least to kind of like balance out. Like that's in all of these games, right? The big thing you have to fight against is that when fighting a single enemy, is that the players always have an action economy advantage that's like really hard to deal with, or really hard to balance against without just like adding more bodies to the fight. And so I think
okay.
Yeah. I think
Legendary actions are pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think they solved that problem pretty elegantly.
Yeah, I was a big fan of this comes back to my love of 4th edition. 4th edition had special it was like, because bloodied was a thing. You had before and after bloodied kind of thing, and bloodied almost always had like a second boss phase essentially kind of associated with it, right? So for instance, dragons in 4th edition had bloodied breath. When they get bloodied, they instantly, no matter what, unleash a breath attack, right? And it's just like stuff like that I always thought was really clever and useful. And that's the kind of stuff that I've always sort of brought forward. But the idea of a legendary action, kind of, you get an extra little sort of slot in the turn order. That's not like a full move, like to do stuff, but I don't know. That's pretty interesting. That's pretty compelling stuff. I also know that there's like layer actions and stuff. People have told me about this, but I don't know anything about that stuff. And
layer actions are like if you find a creature in its lair, dragons in particular, they get like to do an extra thing, which I also think is like super cool. Like I think that's a good thing to do. Like I think.
Oh, really? Layer actions? Okay.
Layer action, right? Like, and that's like a level of like player agency, right? Like if you choose to fight the dragon in its lair, you are going to have a worse time than if you drew it out, right? In fact, we made that mistake in our game, right? Like, we had made a bunch of like the way the GM put it is like you guys had constantly like taken these risks, and they had always paid off, and then you like fought like a higher level green dragon in its lair, and you just like got smoked, right? Like it was a tough fight, and we almost TPK'd there, but and we ended up having to negotiate, and like it had like bad ramifications for the campaign. But I think that's a cool mechanic for dealing with that. Yeah.
What are some examples of lair actions?
So since I haven't really run the game, I don't know what exactly qualifies, but it like you could tell that fight was harder because the dragon was in his lair, right? Like,
yeah, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm in my GMing 5e journey, I'm pretty low leveled. Right, like they're level 3, it's milestone leveling, and they have to complete 2 dungeons in order to level up. I've revealed this much. Okay, so nobody's getting a fucking thing. But basically, I've been designing these monster counters or whatever, right? But I haven't been thinking at all about any of this extra stuff. But I've just been designing based on my kind of like 4E mindset that triggers all of this stuff, right? So like there are certain creatures that they drop to bloodied, they get an extra action, right? That they can take on their turn, and it does something different, right? Or like the minotaurs, they fought a bunch of these minotaurs. The minotaurs have a bonus action where they do a little AoE ground pound war stomp thing, and it does 2 things for them. One, the minotaurs are built for charging, and the ground pound removes the reaction of everybody hits, so they can do the war stomp and then charge somebody without taking a bunch of AOs. But it also just kind of adds this like ambient pulsing AoE damage that is always going out, right? To try and keep things feeling more fair as they kind of end up doing these sort of 5v1s against whatever kids.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hey, listen, one of these days we'll play fucking 2E, or I'll play 2E and I'll have some real opinions, but here we are.
Yeah. No. It was a good chat. Glad to talk about it, especially now that we're at the kind of end of 5.0. Yeah, so I'm surprised you've been like looking at or even here just because this 5e game you were running is ending. We're not gonna transition, right? Yeah, I mean I will guess I'll get more into it if we run another 5e game with that. If I run another 5e game with that, or if the GM for that group runs another 5e game. But it's also one of those things where it's like I was at Gen Con, and in order to like follow this, I would have had to have stood in line to buy a pre-sale book. I was like, I want to play games.
Yeah.
I also didn't read the Starfinder playtest, which came out this weekend. Which
This is Starfinder 2e, right?
yes, Starfinder 2, which is fully cross compatible with Pathfinder 2e. Yeah, this is one of these things where it's like, I'm sure people will pick and choose pieces, but like I don't expect like the what's the name of one of these fucking things, like the Solarian to show up in the 2e game, unless it's run by Mark, but that's in particular, right? Like there, it's cool because you could the conceit of Starfinder is that elves and dwarves exist, but they don't have to go rewrite all of that stuff in the Starfinder rulebook, right? Like you just pull the elf out of the
I played one of I played like a little Rocket Raccoon guy. What are they called? Yukis or Yusukis or something like that?
Oh, yokai. No, not yokai. Yosokai, maybe
Isoki. Yeah, I think that's what it was. Yeah, it was like
nice people.
His name was Swizz something.
Yeah.
But yeah, Swizz was a mechanic, and he had a little spider bot that did stuff whose name I don't remember. But
yeah, and the kind of cute mascot character of Skittermanders, which are fuzzy, six-armed things. But that's that is what it is. But
what else happened at Gen Con?
So I went to a couple of Starfinder panels, and I'm sorry, but they were not great. It was mostly this is a thing that's happened in the past at Gen Con, where half the Paizo panels are fun and talk to us about design stuff, and we'll give you and maybe let you guys contribute some stuff, and half of them are kind of here are products that are coming out or have come out and what you can use them for. And the panels I went to were all the kind of here are products type, and so they were not my favorite. I bailed on them relatively early, but I did play a couple more NSDM games, National Security Decision Making. The one I played on Saturday was American Revolution, and basically what it was is they assign you a founding father, and they're like, go do a Continental Congress.
That sounds awesome. I did that in high school, and it was super fun. We got rid of the what's the compromise that was the Senate and the House? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, the bicameral thing?
Yeah. We had a third this was my idea, because I was like, fuck the bicameral Congress. We had a third house where people got drafted to serve in the legislature.
So this is not the Constitutional Convention. This is the two Continental Congresses. One was the first one was a letter to the king, being
right, the Declaration of Independence.
That was the second one. The first one was kind of maybe let's try and work this out, and the second one was the Declaration. I got assigned Christopher Gadsden of Gadsden Flag fame. I was like, oh boy, I've rolled my nat 20 for this one. And then when they were when we were starting to run it, they were like, oh, we need to nominate someone to run the proceedings, right? Effectively a speaker. And somebody nominates Sam Adams, a true patriot. Somebody nominates somebody from Ben Franklin, right? Because he was from the Middle States, the three big groups of the North State, the New England, the Middle States, and the South. And then the guy from Maryland just points at me and says, he's got a cool flag. And they voted for me. So I didn't actually do much policy making. I was just doing parliamentarian running of stuff, right? And they didn't give us any we were kind of I was kind of doing not quite Robert Rules of Orders, but I was just kind of running it with recognizing people and giving them time limits. And at very 15 minutes into, they're so part of this is we looked and we couldn't find any good historical record of what type of procedures they used, so we left it open and let you guys experiment with it, right? So basically it was me iron fisting through this he does no I felt kind of bad, but there was a vote, and the guy kept trying to ask a question. I was like, yay or nay? It's like, no, but, and it's like, New Hampshire abstains. And I just moved on to the next person.
That actually sounds awesome. Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds so fucking cool, and I
Uh,
don't know. That's it.
no, I
that
mean,
sounds awesome.
it was super fun. The other game was also super fun. It was 50 years. It was like a near future science fiction. 50 years in the future, ice caps have melted, sea levels have risen about a foot. This has caused all sorts of disasters, right? Like people are working on aquaculture. People are moving inland from various places, and the two teams were, or the positions were like all either United States or China, right? Like I got assigned the third world patron for China, which is like, you know, the Belt and Road thing, right? Like essentially third world outreach. And as the game starts, the kind of twist is that basically Kraken are attacking submarines, and it's like they might be intelligent, right? But one of these was like off the Arctic or the Antarctic. There was one like near Chile, and like the defense minister told me is like, I want better relationship with Chile. So I just spent the entire game talking to one of the facilitators and like slowly like making Chile a client state of China. It was so much fun. It was a lot of back and forth and like arguing, and I got recognized for it. I got like, you know, they named like the 6 top players, and I got number 5. So, you know, they gave me
Look at you.
yeah, they gave me a book, but it was just like a lot of just kind of like, you know, pounding the pace. Like, all right, Navy, tell me if you're willing to give them ships. All right, defense minister, sign off on this, right? You know,
Yeah.
all right, Chile wants high speed rail infrastructure. Can you? They're like, yeah, sure, right? Like, and a lot of kind of like glad handing, like catching people at the right moment where they didn't read anything too close. It's like, you know, it's like, oh, we're gonna give them this. Like, yes, it's worth it, right? And then you don't ask about cost, right? Like, you know, just like get them to sign it and push it through. But you know, it was. I wish I had been kind of like a fly on the wall on the other side of the room, because I would see like things like they have like a news feed go by. And I would see things like, you know, the Tea Party in the United States Congress launches an investigation into hentai. I'm like, what the fuck is happening on that side of the room? Apparently, like the apparently it was like a split state, or you know, like I guess it would have been like a, you know, Democratic-ish president and like a Republican-ish Congress. Apparently, the majority leader was just like on his shit, like getting things through and getting things done, which I thought was like super fun. Yeah, yeah. And then you know, what else did I do? I played a game called The Fifth Conspiracy, which I thought was pretty neat. It's urban fantasy. It's basically like there's a, you know, kind of like there's a secret world. You're a member of it, right? Like, and there's different classes of it. The guy who ran the game was the creator. It's like a thing that's in playtest. I thought it was fun. The guy told us, he's like, oh, you might know me because I was like the lead designer of Roll20. And I was like, Roll20? I've used Roll20. And like I had to be like, bloated JavaScript piece of crap, right? Like,
Yeah.
But you know, he was a really nice dude, and I liked the system. Little bit like a lot of these kind of indie titles tend to be like very, very fluffy. This had just enough crunch that I felt like I, like, you know, was making real decisions based on my character rather than kind of like.
Yeah, I feel that. One of the things, you know, over the weekend, or I guess over like last weekend or whatever, I took a trip. We took a trip to Yosemite. We went to Yosemite Valley in, I guess it's also California. But way north of California. That's different from where I am, California. And one of the things we did is we listened to the first couple of episodes of the new Dimension 20 series, which is called Never Stop Blowing Up, which the core conceit of this is they're playing kind of pastiches of action movie stars, right? So one character, famously Vic Ethanol, right, is playing essentially Dominic Toretto in Vin Diesel as Dominic Toretto in the Fast and Furious franchise, right? But then there's also another guy who is just James Bond, right? So it's like, okay, well, what if James Bond and this person, they all came together and they were an adventuring party, essentially, that kind of thing. And the system is called Kids on Bikes. and it is built to sort of evoke the idea of the Goonies, essentially, right? But they've modified it to a certain extent, and it like works differently. But like at the end of the day, those systems feel so fluffy and kind of intangible in a kind of like a variety of different ways. And really I just don't know that I've ever played a system that is not sort of directly D&D, you know, but 3E, 5E, whatever, like this level of kind of crunch that satisfies my sort of like crunch. This is sort of what I mean a little bit about the Star Wars Fantasy. I liked playing that Star Wars Fantasy Flight, and we played a lot of it, obviously, right? But at the end of the day, the character progression just like was not as interesting as I wanted it to be, compared to something like, D&D, or even Warhammer was like this. Warhammer, that also has like you put guys on your battle map and you're moving and you're making attack rolls and damage rolls, like that kind of stuff. And it's just like, I don't know, with that it's hard for me to get into the crunch of any tabletop system.
Yeah, no, I feel that. One that I did, so I played a couple of games that were. Have you ever played a game that's like powered by the apocalypse, PBTA? So Apocalypse World was a game that came out a while ago.
Oh my God, I know Apocalypse World. I'm sorry, Apocalypse World. What am I thinking? I'm thinking something world though. But it is a.
Is it
Gamma
Dungeon
World?
Gamma
World is what I'm thinking.
So there were a couple of these things in like the world thing. So the mechanic is you have like a playbook, right? Like your character has like some tags, and you roll 2d6 and you add your tags to it. And if you hit a target number, you win, and if you're under it, you lose. It's like light and fluffy enough that like everybody just like throws like a rule set on top. Like they use that as like the core mechanic, and they throw basically conceits on top of it, and it just kind of works. And it's good for like light play, right? Like so the one game I played the Root, based on your recommendation to play the Root board game.
Oh sure, the board game.
I played the Root TTRPG and this game called City of Mists, which are both PBTA, powered by the Apocalypse. Root was a little too loose for me, but City of Mist was interesting at least. The idea is that you are a normal human in the City of Mists, and like some legend has decided to manifest itself in you, right? So like one of the characters at the table was a child psychiatrist who the legend of the boogeyman was manifesting itself in this child psychiatrist, and she had a gunny sack that she could drag things into to, right, like, basically drag them down. I was playing a gamer who lived in his mom's basement and had played so many video games that he had become one with nothing, right? He had basically achieved nirvana. And the way that manifested is he could, like, turn doors into pixels and, like, make them disappear. He also had, like, a force of Shaolin monks that he could like call on to like jump in and like do martial arts, right? And as a kind of narrative system, I thought it worked well, but the combat I thought kind of dragged because they try and keep you from like doing the same thing over and over again by saying you can't do the same thing twice, but it just ends up kind of being, and then I do the one thing and then I do the second thing and then I go back to the first thing. You just kind of like bounce back and forth. There's not a ton of mechanical depth there. Like that's the thing that like that is a system where you need the GM to really be like on their toes to like make the scene interesting and make it a thing that you want to respond to in interesting ways rather than just kind of like your rote powers. I think that was the other thing I want to talk about that was crunchy enough, but I didn't particularly like was I think there was like an expansion book that came out here. It's like Marvel's Multiverse. The name of the event was like Deadpool Saves the Multiverse. And it's a fairly crunchy superhero game. And I thought it was good for running, like they had like statted out character sheets for like certain Marvel heroes. Like I played Paladin, which isn't a character I was super familiar with, but like there was Hitmonkey and there was Luke Cage at the table, right? But the thing they had pitched about it was that you can play, you can build your own hero with these power sets, right? The problem is that like they had like listed out power sets. One of the power sets was spider powers, right? Like it's like you can only build like one type of person with spider powers, right? And I think the problem with this is weirdly the opposite problem. I think for superhero game, you don't want a. It can be crunchy, but it can't be like very set things because part of what I think makes superheroes feel special is everyone's like a little bit weird and a little bit different, right? Like, and they're a little bit unique, and you can't have a set like one set was spider powers, one set was weather control, and there was like a generic kind of like shooty and punchy ones, but like they also weren't super satisfying. Like Paladin had a bunch of shooty ones, and it was like half the powers I had in my sheet were like shoot two things at once in like a chain feat, right? Like there's like a power chain. It didn't feel super satisfying, and so like I thought it was, like I said, I thought it was good for like playing a particular hero, but I don't think it would be good for like a custom campaign. Otherwise, like I picked up a game that's basically Liar's Dice, but with like extra cards, which I thought was super fun. I don't know if you ever played Liar's Dice with us in college. I know we did it a lot while we were.
I don't think I ever did. I know the mechanics of Liar's Dice because of a YouTube video I watched. So
yeah,
the best I can give you. Yeah.
Yeah. No. When we would drink, we would pull out the dice and like do Liar's Dice as a drinking game, which was a ton of fun. I know you weren't about that life back then. Yeah. But like it was basically it's Liar's Dice, but you also get cards to give extra effects. Like what? That's pretty cool.
That is pretty interesting. I'm a big fan of cards. This is Gamma World was cards actually. The thing that was fun about Gamma World is it's but you're mutating, and when I say mutating, I mean literally. You are constantly mutating. Like I think the rule is at the beginning of every session. I didn't play too much of this. I played 5 or 6 sessions of it, right? But the idea is that at the beginning of every session, you have these mutation cards, right? And it's really just them trying to sell you like the deck of cards. Obviously, you have these mutation cards, and at the beginning of every session, you lose one of your draw a new mutation, right? And the idea is that like you are slowly mutating over time. So my thing was I made myself a mutant polar bear because I had bone spikes I had claws, I had bone spike things, kind of like Spike from X-Men Evolution, if you know who I'm talking about. Make a bone spike and throw it at something kind of thing. And I had an ice power, like an ice breath thing. And I was like, oh well, my character has been mutated with polar bear stuff. He's like a fucked up polar bear kind of thing, right? But obviously the polar bear stuff, that's all just like whatever. But then slowly over time, okay, well then you lose the bone power and you pick up a different power, and you lose that power and you pick up a third power, and you just start like shuffling out your powers. And as you level up, I think you have more powers or you got more choices on what like the powers were or whatever. But the idea is you're just like constantly like mutating, which I thought was pretty cool and pretty fun. In the first couple sessions, I was mostly just using my ice breath. But eventually I got to a position where I was doing a lot of combat because I kind of specialized around claw, stuff like that. And I just think, man, cards are sweet. I love cards as like a, I don't know, piece of the adventuring puzzle.
Yeah, that makes sense. What else did you do with your week? I know you got sick, but did you do anything fun before that?
Yeah, so I went to university. I got super sick. I went to Dry Town. Okay, with the premier water park of Palmdale, California, which we went to last year, but this time we went with Warren, which was a lot of fun. But honestly, like most of my sort of like week and my time has been kind of anchored, maybe you'd call it, right? I don't really feel like I have a game that I'm playing a lot of, or diving deep into, or super, like getting super into. I started playing Humankind again. I played about 5 minutes of Civ 6 and I was like, you know what, I just want to play Human. And so I was playing a little bit of Humankind. I was playing a little bit of WoW, progressing on the Taiwan achievement, playing a bunch of Battlegrounds. I don't think I'm going to, the new Battleground season is in like 2 weeks or something. I do not think I'm going to break 7K. So unfortunately I am dog shit at that fucking game. And it's mostly just kind of like been that. I had the return of I was able to play Mateo Vasquez last week, which was nice. Big fun. Mateo Vasquez being my mastermind rogue in Rachel's Pirates game, where we had to. Well, that's a very open-ended game, and this is perfect for me because I got to set. I was like, you know what I want to do? I want to break into the harbor master's office, and I want to get a ship registration so that if we get stopped or we go into port, I can present, ship, like the proper ship documents. So the whole thing was about, can you break into the, can you break into the harbor master's office? And we were kind of mulling around a little bit, and I didn't want to get too involved. It was sort of like letting other people do things. And then I was like, okay, I pick the lock on this window, success. Okay, I sneak in, success. I stealth. I rustle around. I steal the harbor master sigil. I'm picking more locks, and I just kind of kept rolling successes, and I never alerted anybody. So I eventually got to this point where I was in the back room of the harbor master's office with all of the records, but Mateo's intelligence is an 8, and so I couldn't succeed the investigation check to figure out what a boat license looked like. So then I had to go back out, sneak somebody else back in order to actually hit the investigation checks that we were all like, that we were all whiffing, which was all like very fun. We got to one point where I rolled a crit failure I was hiding outside of the harbor master's office because we had just fucked up sneaking in, and somebody, like a clerk who was just at his desk, looked at me as I like tripped over a fucking like empty tin bucket or something, and it just like clattered to the ground or something like that. And I was like, oh, he just saw me. And so then I did the very classic Mateo thing of running to the door, opening the window, and telling the guy who just saw me sneaking away from the scene of a crime, there were some guys. I was trying to hide from them. They went that away, kind of thing, right? Like that kind of stuff. And that's fun. That's good, all natural. Good wholesome rogue fun, I guess. But I don't know. That's really been it. I've mostly been wondering whether or not we're going to be updating our games to 5.5e when it comes to that, because all of our games right now are 5e essentially.
Nice. Yeah. Very cool. Very, very cool. I dipped my toes into Battlegrounds like before I left on for this trip. And I wasted like a whole afternoon on it. So, good job.
Did you win? Did you win a little? Did you get good?
I won a little, not enough to like keep me playing. It's like one of those things where like I don't know, like I feel like I have to know the set well enough to like know what to pick, and it's like it takes a half hour per instead of like the 10 minutes that like a Street Fighter session takes if I want to just do like a round of Street Fighter. So
yeah, it's 100% my podcast game. I guess I don't know. WoW is also my like podcast game. Like if I'm like whatever paying attention to like Boogie 2988 drama or something like that, listening to a YouTube video about whatever dumb shit is going on. It's very easy to just kind of be like managing my guys in Battlegrounds. Honestly, when Battlegrounds hits, it's super fun. Like when you get like the really, really good, powerful, fun builds. There's a build called Moon Eater Bran, where Bran is a 5-star minion and Moon Eater 5-star minion. Moon Eater says whenever you play an odd cost card, give all of your odd cost minions +1/+1, right? Bran is obviously odd costed and he doubles battle cries. And so the idea is you get Moon Eater and Bran, and then you just like churn cards, because Bran lets you get like, any card that's like battle cry, get a creature. Well, now you're getting 2 creatures, right? And that you churn stuff like that. And that build is so fun to get off the ground and get up and running, right? Some of the other ones can be super fun. I had a wild Goldrin game. Goldrin says, for the rest of this combat, your beasts have +4/+4. And it's a death rattle. And so I kept using a stealth spell on Baron Rivendare, who doubles death rattles, right? And then just like a bunch of stupid bullshit in order to make my Goldrins just continuously buff. And I had like 3 of them, and they were just going super, super hard. And it's just like, I don't know, that's like when Battlegrounds is fun. But like when you can't get off the ground, when you're just like picking a bunch of bullshit because it's like, well, none of this synergizes, so I'm just going to take the best stats in the tavern and I'm dead again, right? Like
yeah, makes sense.
Okay.
Boy.
Well, I guess that's that.
Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to talk about before we jet out of here?
Nope.
All right. Well, if you'd like to email us about anything you saw on this podcast, you could, or listen to on this podcast, you email us at derpsplaygames@gmail.com or podcast at derpsplaygame.com. Follow us at twitch.tv/derpsplaygames or youtube.com/@derpsplaygames, where these go out live. Do links to everything are down in the description. Rate, review us. But you have anything else you're looking to promote?
Am I looking for anything else I'm looking at? Yeah, hey, you know what? On Thursday, I'm going to be on a fucking debate live stream. There's this guy, small YouTuber name is Wick TV, and he's hosting a live stream debate that I have agreed to participate in about whether or not 5.5 is like good. He was looking for people who are pro 5.5, and he couldn't find people. And he just put out a tweet for it. And I was like, you know what? Fucking, yeah, sure. I'll do that. I have a professional, recording setup, right? Like I could appear on some like YouTube channel. And honestly, I think it's going to go poorly because my expectation is that this is going to end up kind of being culture war nonsense when all I want to talk about is the crunch, right?
Oh.
Like from my point of view, it is.
Oh, is this going to be about like, that what do they call them? They're not races in their
species, right?
Yeah, species don't have like stat bonuses anymore or something.
Yeah, and they also got rid of half orcs and half elves, right? Which according to wizards is like the questionable circumstances of like these mixed races or whatever.
Race mixing is bad, buddy. Miscegenation is not allowed.
The funny thing is the thing that they're trying to avoid is like the implication that half orcs are all children of rape, essentially. Which I have always hated. I mean, the way that I've always half orcs is that they are, essentially they are their own sort of sub-breed of orc, right?
Sure.
When two half orcs have a kid, they have a half orc kid, obviously, right? But I guess their position is that you are always the child of rape.
Well, that was like a common thing back in the older editions, but like also like I'm sure inside of the world of 5e, there's at least one human child that is the product of like a sexual assault, right?
Right. It's exactly right. And it's just like I don't know, but they just ported orcs over entirely, which frankly I'm a fan of. Obviously, I have this sort of identity for half orc in kind of carved out in the way that I run my games, right? But at the end of the day, there's not all that much difference between like real orcs and half orcs, right? And they fall into that kind of like quote unquote evil races that we've always hated with like goblins, all that kind of stuff. And I feel like I'm going to get dragged into this culture war nonsense. My point is that weapon mastery is good. It's like the sticking point that I think is that I'm going to sell all of 5.5 on is that weapon masteries are neat and they are good for the game. So
interesting.
That's it.
Well, best of luck to you. I hope you regret it and you never cheat on this podcast again.
Okay.
But good luck. All three people that watch this podcast go support Buddy, so at least somebody is on his side. But with that, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Listen, until next time, loyal listeners.